Thank you very much for attending this 6th in a series of webinars which are being run by Coram Chambers and during the COVID lockdown, which is the National Emergencies Trust Coronavirus Appeal. This webinar is free, but we would love it if you would consider making a donation to the appeal. I ought to say that we are doing this via Zoom, so if I could ask everybody to put their microphone on mute, and that will just make sure that we don't have any background noise and disruption during the webinar. And also to let you know that we're recording this webinar, so if you don't want to be appearing in any of the videos which appear on Coram's YouTube channel afterwards, then please can I ask you to turn off your video recording or video now. I think that probably, oh no, I've been given a script, you see, to follow at this point. Coram are going to continue its series of webinars following today. We announced those on our Twitter and LinkedIn pages, so keep an eye out for them. Right, that is the script bit done, thankfully. Introduction about who I am. I'm Amanda Bewley, I'm a barrister at Coram Chambers, and I practice in public and private children law matters as well as inquests. I've been at Coram for a year now, although you might not have seen me around the London courts until say about autumn of last year. And the reason for that is I was finishing off a workload of cases from my practice up in Nottingham, which I held for 8 years. If you see me at court and we haven't met before, please come and say hello, because I'm actually one of the most sociable people I know, and it's guaranteed to make my day if you come and say hi to me, and we can have a little chat or go for a coffee or whatever. Obviously, today's webinar is about a really important subject, but it does have the ability to cause distress, especially to those of you who might have been touched personally by the issue of suicide. If you do become distressed during this webinar, can I please ask you to talk to someone, a friend, family member or colleague? If you don't feel that you're able to talk to somebody close to you, then there are so many organisations who are there and ready to talk to you. They're listed in a handout which will be provided to you either by email if you've joined us by Zoom, or which will be available in the description to the video on YouTube. And I put them at the end of the handout so that you can quickly identify them. If you haven't got time to do that and you are feeling distressed, the Samaritans are available 24 hours a day, every single day of the year, and you don't have to be feeling suicidal to contact them. They say on their website that they are waiting for your call, and you can call them on 116 123. In terms of the structure of this webinar, firstly, I just want to set out in brief why I say that this is such an important subject about which we should all be familiar, so that we know how to respond if we face somebody who we think could be suicidal. I'll then look at specific risk factors for suicide, as well as warning signs to look out for. Then we'll look at how you can respond if you are concerned about someone's safety. And I will round off by looking at why I think that the COVID-19 emergency increases the need for us to have an awareness of this issue. And in addition, I will just use the opportunity to invite you all to follow the Mental Health Awareness Week theme for this year, which is kindness, and for you to be kind to one another and to look out for one another at this time. And then we'll just round things off with questions. Now, in respect of questions, I know that Rakaya, who's our brilliant marketing manager at Coram, is going to be looking at the chat function in the Zoom room, as I like to call it, throughout this webinar. So if a question occurs to you during the webinar, please feel free to type it into the chat function. And at the end of the webinar, Rakaya will put those questions to me. Alternatively, there will be an option for you to ask questions direct. I will do my best to answer them, but I can't promise that I will be able to answer them. And that leads me really to issuing a caveat. I'm a barrister, I'm not a mental health professional, and I'm not an expert in suicide prevention. It's really important for me to state that, because what this webinar does is it draws together my knowledge base, which I've obtained from training with the Samaritans on managing suicidal conversations, as well as training that I've accessed online via the Zero Suicide Alliance and other sources, including the very good resources available via the Samaritans website and via the World Health Organization. And what I've attempted to do is draw all of that knowledge together and bring together all of those bits of advice which are replicated across those platforms and apply it to life as a family law practitioner. And I hope in that way that that will be a useful place for us all to start in terms of our education and how to deal with this area. So why do we need training in this area? What first drew my attention to the need for training was direct experience of 2 suicidal litigants within about a 2-week time frame. And those were particularly difficult incidents. And afterwards, I realised that I hadn't had training to deal with it, and that training may well have benefited me in terms of how I dealt with those particular individuals. In fact, looking back at how I dealt with those individuals, I can see now, with the information I have, what I would do differently. I also had discussions with colleagues in chambers and opponents at court, and I quickly realised that actually my experiences were not unusual. And when we look at the risk factors shortly as to those who may be more vulnerable to suicide, it will become obvious why my experience was not particularly unusual. But I think that as well as thinking about training from a personal point of view, what I've realised when I've looked into this issue in more detail is that suicide is preventable. Let that sink in for a second, because actually I think many people consider that some people's suicides are inevitable, but the advice from everyone is that suicide is preventable. And that's why training is crucial. Suicide is a major public health issue. The World Health Organization have reported 800,000 deaths per year globally as a result of suicide. That equates to someone in the world ending their own life every 40 seconds. In the UK, it is the leading cause of death in men under the age of 50. That's above cancer, heart disease, strokes. Sometimes I think global figures as well can make you feel a bit removed. So just in terms of the UK figures, they equate to someone attempting suicide every 4 minutes and somebody completing suicide every 30 minutes. So in the time that it takes us to go through this webinar, which I anticipate will be about an hour, there will have been 2 people in the UK who will have ended their own lives, and 90 globally. Every suicide, as I said earlier, is a death which can be prevented, and it leaves a colossal impact on those who are left behind. The Zero Suicide Alliance say for that each person who ends their life, there are 20 people who will feel the impact of that. Suicide rates are the highest they've been in this country in 20 years. And it's anticipated that the COVID-19 crisis is going to mean that we have more people in this country suffering from poor mental health. It's important to realise that many people who feel suicidal don't actually want to end their lives. They just don't want to live the life that they're living in that moment. And they feel that suicide is the only option available to them. Suicide is never the answer to the problem. I'm sure some of you will have heard this before, but it's said that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. The Zero Suicide Alliance have introduced some short online training, which I saw this week, in fact, on the BBC, had received over 500,000 views or participants. And what they've done is they've tried to launch their own public health campaign. All of us will think about the public health campaigns that we've seen where people might be having a stroke and how to respond, for example. Given the fact that Suicide is the largest killer of men in this country under the age of 50. It's about time that people had a public health campaign which enabled them to respond to people who are suicidal. And they've introduced something which is simple and memorable in terms of a formula, which is see, say, signpost. And I'm going to adopt that in terms of the way that we look at this particular issue within this webinar. See. To help us see those who might be at risk, it's helpful to know what the risk factors are for suicide. And first and foremost, I think I ought to make it clear that suicide's a very complex matter, and there could be any number of reasons why a person feels suicidal. It's unlikely that there's going to be just one of the risk factors present that we go through, which leads to someone experiencing suicidal thoughts or behaviours. There can be psychological, societal and cultural factors at play. But there are risk factors which do increase a person's vulnerability. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight some of those for you and perhaps talk about some of them briefly, just in terms of their application to the family justice system. The first risk factor, perhaps predictably, and I imagine most of you would have identified this as a risk factor if I'd asked, is mental health. The Samaritans say that 90% of people, they estimate that 90% of people who end their life by suicide were experiencing a diagnosed or undiagnosed health condition at the time of their death. Depression is the mental health diagnosis which is most commonly associated with suicide. Now, as family practitioners, especially those of us involved in public law matters, we frequently come into contact with those who have very complex mental health profiles. And so when we look at our papers for a case, for example, we might be able to read an assessment about someone, we'll often have a lot of information about them already. And it might be that we're able to identify some of these risk factors, even subconsciously, which then might inform our judgment about somebody's state of mind later on within proceedings. Other factors which increase the risk include drug and or alcohol abuse. And again, we see that frequently, especially in public law proceedings, but increasingly so perhaps in private law proceedings. And I anticipate following COVID that alcohol will in fact become a factor which we need to be more alive to. Previous trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, child abuse and domestic abuse all increase the risk posed. People who are in contact with the criminal justice system have been identified as those being particularly high risk. The criminal justice system, of course, doesn't just include the criminal courts, it includes prisons, probation and police. And within family proceedings, we frequently come across clients or participants who have been involved in one way or another with the criminal justice system, frequently at the same time as being involved in the family justice system. One of the important factors is, in terms of warning signs, feelings of shame and failure. And those are the types of things which can sometimes be associated with somebody who's facing serious allegations within the criminal justice system. Another risk factor to be aware of are prior suicide attempts. Now, it makes a person 100 times more likely to end their life by suicide if they've previously attempted to end their life by suicide than members of the general public. Self-harming behaviours are also a risk indicator. Again, frequently, this is the type of information that will be available to us as practitioners within family law proceedings and things to be alive to. Other risk factors include social isolation, access to lethal means, chronic disease and disability, and discrimination. People in the LGBTQ+ population are more likely to have experienced bullying, violence and discrimination. And in fact, belonging to any group with protected characteristics can be a risk factor for suicide. Knowing someone who has taken their own life can increase your risk, and someone who's been bereaved by suicide has a higher risk of attempting suicide themselves. Inappropriate reporting and celebrity suicides can also increase the risk. And so if you're dealing with a lay client who is saying that they identify particularly to a suicide that's being reported widely within the press, that's something to be perhaps aware of. Other risk factors include lack of access to appropriate support. That can be for any number of reasons. That can be because somebody doesn't want to engage with support. It can be stigma. It can be lack of acceptance that they require that support. Or unfortunately, and more tragically, it can be lack of resources. And I know all of us will have experienced cases where our clients are put on waiting lists that seem just tragically long, 6 months and longer, waiting to have the type of support that they desperately need. And sometimes for them to reach the top of that waiting list and for them then to be assessed as not requiring that intervention. Again, in terms of the COVID-19 crisis and what we can expect economically for the country moving forward, we have to be prepared for the fact that these support services are going to be stretched and that they may not have adequate funding. Poverty increases your risk of suicide, and suicide rates are higher in areas of socio-economic deprivation. Other indicators include relationship breakdown. And of course, all of us in family proceedings come across this frequently, whether that be because we're involved in money cases, in cases where parents have separated and can't agree on the arrangements for their children, and also in public law cases. It's really important for us to be aware of the fact that men are in fact 3 times more likely than women to end their own lives, and that the highest risk is amongst divorced men, who are then 3 times more likely again to end their lives. Loss and conflict, including financial loss and emotional conflict, can also increase risk of vulnerability to suicidal thoughts and behaviours, and impulsive and aggressive behaviour. And again, we will have all had those cases where there's somebody involved in the case who perhaps has a history of impulsive or aggressive behaviour. So these are all the types of risk factors which it appears to me when I've been undertaking this work may well be relevant to the issue of suicide prevention for family practitioners. So what might be the warning signs? You've got an idea now of the risk factors, and I apologise that it's a canter through those, but what I've done is I have created quite a detailed handout which accompanies this webinar, and it includes all of those risk factors within there. So the warning signs that you might see in somebody. Perhaps they're obviously distressed or upset. Perhaps they're unusually tired or irritable. Now, I've said unusually there. Clearly, there will be circumstances when, on first meeting someone, you develop a concern about them, and you're not going to be able to have a baseline as to how they usually come across. But similarly, there'll be cases where we have clients throughout where we get a good idea of what they're like, whether or not they're irritable, or if they're getting a good night's sleep, if they're looking after their appearance, and so on. So if somebody's unusually tired and irritable, then that can be a warning sign. Likewise, if somebody's not taking care of their daily tasks as well as they can do usually, then that could be a warning sign to us that things aren't right, that they're not feeling at their best, and that they might potentially be feeling hopeless or even suicidal. If somebody talks about suicide or death, if there are anyone out there who still believes the myth that people who talk about suicide are not to be worried about, we need to bust that myth now. If somebody tells you they feel suicidal, you need to take that risk seriously, because people who tell people that they are suicidal go on to complete suicide. There will also be those clients who express hopelessness, pessimism, or sadness about the future. And it's important that we tune in to what our clients are saying to us when they talk about their situation. Do they sound hopeless about the future? Are they expressing feelings of worthlessness, saying that they don't deserve to have help? Expressions of helplessness or guilt or failure? Perhaps they might say something which indicates that they feel that they're a burden or an annoyance to others, or that people or things would be better off if they weren't around. Perhaps they might say something like, I'm just doing my husband's head in and I can just tell he's fed up with me and it would be so much better for him if I weren't around anymore. Those are the types of comments that we need to really tune into and pay attention to, because that might be somebody who's expressing some really concerning thoughts and feelings. Somebody as well who might express feelings of isolation, loneliness, or of not feeling as though they belong. That's particularly important because what's sometimes considered a protective factor is a feeling of connectedness. So what should I do then? I've got somebody who I'm concerned about. They've got some known risk factors to me, maybe none in fact, but they're starting to express themselves in a way that causes me some concern. So what should I do? Say. Talk to someone if you're concerned and ask directly if they're thinking about suicide. So first and foremost, talk to someone and listen to them. Again, there's a popular misconception that talking to someone about suicide will actually increase the risk of that person feeling suicidal or attempting or completing suicide. And that leads to some people having a fear of asking questions in case they might suggest suicide in some way to someone, or that they might make them feel uncomfortable. The University of Oxford has a suicide research centre, and they've addressed this question head on. So I'll tell you what they say to this question. Does inquiry about suicidal thoughts increase a patient's risk? Their response is this: no. There is no evidence that patients are suggestible in this way. In reality, many patients are relieved to be able to talk about suicidal thoughts. The advice from all the platforms, again, is clear about this, that a few words can make a world of difference, and that we should be direct in our questioning. That sometimes can be difficult because of the stigma around suicide and mental health and our own worries and concerns about whether or not we might make somebody's situation worse. I'm here to reassure you that you will not make somebody's situation worse if you ask them outright, are you suicidal? Do you have thoughts about ending your life? Have you thought about how you might do that? It is always appropriate to ask the direct questions and avoid using stigmatizing and euphemistic language, such as, you're not going to do anything silly, are you? Or you're not thinking of doing something silly, are you? Because in using that type of language, you're minimizing how that person is feeling and introducing shame, and also potentially making that person feel that their problems aren't worth someone's time. It's also important to try and avoid blaming statements, such as, how do you think your family would feel if you were to hurt yourself? You will not guilt trip somebody out of harming themselves, but you might make them feel worse if you say things like that to them. Direct questioning not only offers somebody the chance of telling you how they feel and giving them the opportunity of some reassurance, it can also break the cycle of suicidal thoughts. The Samaritans say that suicidal thoughts can last between 30 and 45 minutes. And what you can do in having that discussion with someone is potentially ride out that period of time and help break that cycle. But there's another reason why these discussions are so important. It's not just to allow somebody an opportunity to talk and to feel better, but it also allows you to gather key information about that person, which helps inform your next steps. So, for example, if you've had a discussion with someone and you ask them about whether or not they've done anything that day to harm themselves, and they tell you that they've taken an overdose, then it's very clear what you need to do. You need to dial 999, or you need to make sure that that person can get to A&E without delay. On the other hand, you might have a discussion about whether or not someone has a plan to end their own life. And if somebody tells you what their planned mechanism is for suicide, then you can make a decision about whether or not they have immediate access to that mechanism. And that again can inform your decision making in terms of whether or not you're dialing 999 and getting somebody straight to the A&E department, or whether or not you're putting them in touch with mental health professionals. If someone's reluctant to talk, and lots of people will be reluctant to talk, they might make statements to put you off. For example, they might say, "Why are you even interested? You don't care about me, leave me alone. You're not going to be able to do anything." In those circumstances, it might feel as though you've hit a brick wall and you might decide to move on. What I would invite you to do is persist. Be gently persistent and kind in the way that you deal with someone. Say, "Sometimes it can help to talk to someone. I want to help. Why don't you tell me what's going on?" You might even say something like, "I care and I want to help." I know that that sometimes feels a bit difficult, especially when we are taking the role as a professional within legal proceedings. But ultimately, if somebody is expressing them perhaps as being undeserving of help, it's important that we let them know that they do deserve help, that everybody deserves help. And that actually, when you're in those darkest times, it can sometimes feel like you're not deserving of help, but you do deserve it. And I want to make sure that you get that help that you need. You could also reassure them as well that it is possible to recover from suicidal feelings and depression. It might feel uncomfortable to do this, but can I say you should take the opportunity to talk to someone that you are worried about. You might never know whether or not it makes a difference to that person, but it could in fact make the difference between life or death. A person should feel safe to talk, but it's important that you be attentive to them and to actively listen to them. Active listening is a whole skill of itself, and it could in fact take up a whole webinar, I would say. What I've done within the handout is I've included as much detail as I think I ought to in the circumstances about active listening and the skills involved with that, so that you can have a look at that and improve your skills at active listening. But the reason why it's important to actively listen is because it can reduce a risk if someone feels supported. It might be that somebody already has good support from mental health services. I would say don't leave it to chance. Don't assume that even though somebody's told you how they feel, that after your involvement, they will go on to then contact that support network. They might not. You might be the last person that they speak to and express these concerns to. And in those circumstances, what you might consider doing is contacting on this person's behalf a member of this support network. You might also want to check with your client what help they have received in respect of their mental health, whether or not they've seen their GP or they do have a mental health practitioner involved with them. Again, this will inform your decisions as to who you should be contacting if you're worried. And it's really important that we remove the stigma about talking about mental health. If all the advice is that a conversation can make the difference between life or death, then it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we remove the stigma and make people feel safe to be able to talk about their mental health. Something that I just want to touch on with you is a discussion about the emotional health scale or emotional resilience. When I describe it, it will make sense. We all know how this feels. It's basically about accumulation of stresses and our ability to deal with them. If we don't have very many stresses going on in our lives and something happens, we're usually quite resilient to be able to deal with that thing as and when it comes our way. But if we've started carrying a number of stresses and they've layered one on top of the other, that can reduce our resilience and our ability to deal with even small stresses. And this is the emotional health scale. When you're already struggling to cope, even small things can become too much to deal with. And the reason why I'm telling you about this is because when you talk to somebody, they might tell you something which objectively seems to be something quite minor, but subjectively for that person, that thing could have been blown all out of proportion due to their inability to cope as well as usual. And at that point, they haven't blown it out of proportion at all, of course, because it's just that they're not resilient and that thing at that particular time is causing them that distress. Don't minimize it. Listen to the person, acknowledge how they're feeling. Another thing that I wanted to talk briefly about is not burdening people further. So one of the things that we can do as lawyers is try and be problem solvers. I mean, we are problem solvers as lawyers. And so if somebody comes to you and they start telling you that they've got these financial worries, they don't know how they're going to make the mortgage repayments and they've got credit cards and bills to pay, sometimes the problem solver in us will go, okay, well, let's sit down and let's draw up a plan of action. Let's write down all your incoming and outgoings, and let's write down who all your creditors are, and we will get the contact numbers for them. You can contact them, have a payment plan, and you might come up with a really sound plan to address that person's financial issues. But if they're already feeling burdened and they're not as resilient as usual, and they're at a point on the emotional health scale, which means that even small things feel like a huge burden to them, then actually giving that person tasks, even though they would be helpful potentially to that person overall, may make them feel overburdened and in fact make their position on the emotional resilience scale worse. Another thing that we can do is to try and offer reassurance to someone. It's important that instead of offering reassurance, especially false reassurances, that we listen instead. You shouldn't offer false reassurances, of course you shouldn't. And you shouldn't give false hope, which goes against what your professional opinion is. So, for example, if somebody's worried about the outcome of a case, being that they will not have their child rehabilitated to their care, and your professional opinion at that point is that it's very unlikely that your client will achieve the rehabilitation of their child to their care, it would be wrong and unethical to give them false reassurances, even though they're expressing that as being the thing that's causing them such levels of distress. Instead of offering long-term practical advice or false assurances and focusing on the facts, focus instead on someone's emotions and feelings. And acknowledge that you can't fix everything for that person, but you can make them feel better about their problems and how they deal with them now by listening to them and making sure that you put them in touch with people who are going to be able to make them feel more resilient and will be able to help them with their problems longer term. In terms of listening to someone as well, it's important not to make assumptions about how a person is feeling or what they're thinking or what they're going to say next. Actively listening to a person will help them, and in order to do that, you need to ask open questions and make sure that you listen to their responses rather than trying to fill in the gaps. It's a bit like examination in chief. We ask open questions to allow someone to tell their own story. I'm sure you don't need to be told, but certain things that might be helpful would be, how are you feeling? What happened? When did you start to feel that way? What do you normally do when you feel like this? One of the things we might stay away from though is why, because the question why is quite loaded and sometimes it can be perceived as expressing judgment. If I can invite all of you, please, when you receive the handouts, or if you access the handouts via the link in the description notes, that you look at the section on active listening, because there's some really good advice and tips and hints about how you can actively listen to someone. And that's going to be particularly important for those of us who don't have that skill. Okay, so you've listened and you've talked. What next? Signpost. Help someone to stay safe for now and direct them to helpful resources. Act to make someone safe now. That's the advice. So this is why the conversation part's so important, because you're going to have found out during that conversation with someone whether you need to act now to keep someone safe by dialing 999 or by putting them in touch with a family member or friend. And those types of discussions will then inform what decision you take. You're acting as a bridge at this point to follow-up care. It's not your responsibility to take on this person's problems and try and fix them for them. And a bit like I issued the caveat at the beginning of this webinar, I'm a barrister, I'm not a mental health practitioner. If you're not a mental health practitioner, then you're not going to have the necessary skill set to help this person longer term. In your role is attempting to prevent suicide and keep people safe, you can act as a bridge to follow-up support. It's really helpful as well to have in your advocate's toolkit a list of organisations who you might be able to refer your client onto. Now, I'm sure all of us have things like orders. We'll have all of our orders in a folder on our computer, so that when we need to do a CMO, we just pull open the right folder and we've got the template there to fill in. Can I invite you to look at the last couple of pages of the handout which you'll receive, which has got a list of organisations, and perhaps just save those couple of pages somewhere on one of your devices, so that if you do come across this issue at court and you quickly need to look for some contacts, you've got them there. Perhaps you haven't got them available and you don't do that and you find yourself in this situation in the future. In those circumstances, a Google search, you will find lots of information. If you go on to really decent websites like the Bar Council's Wellbeing website, which is a dedicated website for wellbeing for barristers and their clerks and personnel in chambers, but which is open to everyone and is a wicked resource, full of really good information, and a contacts page. You could just look at that type of website and you'll quickly have lots of details. And then there's an app that I've become aware of, which appears to be pretty good, called Hub of Hope. Again, that's listed in the contacts at the end of the handout. But what I quite like about this app is that all you have to do is type in your postcode and it comes up with a list of organisations, NHS and independent, who are local to you, who can offer help. They also have a button which says that someone needs help now, and that redirects people to either the crisis text line so that they can text somebody, or to the Samaritans. And of course, there's always the Samaritans, and their number's so easy to remember, 116 123. And if you've got that information, then you'll be able to assist your client and signpost them appropriately. It's not just those organisations though that you can signpost to. So I've said, in an emergency, dial 999, get someone to A&E, or make sure that someone takes them there. You could also call NHS Direct on 111. You might also think about calling your client's GP, and you might think about contacting any mental health practitioner or crisis team who already have involvement with your client. It might be that the person you're talking to has a family member or trusted friend who you could perhaps contact to invite to meet your client at court so that they're safe in the immediate future. One of the things which I can imagine you might be concerned about is the issue of legal privilege, and you're right to be concerned about that. Obviously, discussions that we have with our lay clients are confidential, and you should, where it's appropriate, ask your clients permission to breach that confidence so that you can put them in contact with people who can help them. The Law Society have specific guidance on this, which you may or may not consider helpful. They indicate that if you decide that it's not appropriate to ask for your client's consent to breach confidence, or you feel that you have to do it anyway because your client's at risk of serious harm to themselves, then they say that is a breach of your privilege. You've breached client confidentiality, sorry. But in those circumstances, if there were to be any disciplinary arising out of that, then they would, of course, take into consideration the circumstances. The Bar Council and the BSB handbook has nothing specific about this in terms of guidelines, and I'm pretty sure, having discovered that I might try and make some moves to affect some change in that area. But having spoken to the ethics hotline earlier, the advice that I was given was, again, that we ought to seek permission of our clients to breach their confidence, but that if somebody was at risk of life or limb, then we could, in those circumstances, breach confidentiality, but that we would need to be able to evidence that the reasons for doing that were sound. One of the things that I ought to address, especially in our line of work, is specifically our children. Children have suicidal thoughts, ideation, and behaviours. Tragically, children do die in this country by suicide. Children can be stressed just like anyone else, and they can suffer from depression the same way that adults can, but their coping mechanisms may not be as developed as those of an adult. Some children will have experienced or will be experiencing abuse of one form or another. And it's important that we recognise that children can have these thoughts and feelings and be afflicted by depression. The advice from the World Health Organization is that we should be seeking to decrease the burden on children, and that we should be equipping them with the methods required for dealing with stress. That we should show an understanding of their difficulties and not minimise them, and that we should ensure that they always have easy access to reliable support whenever they need it. One of the things that I think people sometimes fall into the trap of doing with children is minimising their problems as being teenage problems, boy problems, romance problems. But actually there ought to be a recognition, especially in children who have expressed suicidal ideation and engaged in self-harming behaviours and other types of risk factors. It's really, really important that we do not minimise those things that they are expressing distress about, and that we acknowledge these and deal with them. See the problem, say the words, signpost to support. I just want to look briefly at why I think the COVID-19 emergency increases the need for us to improve our knowledge in this area. So in terms of COVID generally, clearly it just increases a whole new raft of stresses for people. That's for litigants and for people in the profession. But thinking specifically about litigants, it's going to increase levels of uncertainty for them, not least because we're not in a position of being able to reassure them about when proceedings are going to conclude. It's also causing delay, which for some becomes unbearable. And that's not just because of what will be inevitably a backlog of cases waiting to be heard, as well as new cases which are being issued, but also from other problems such as experts being unable to report in a timely way because social distancing measures is preventing them from being able to report in the timescales which they usually would. In all cases, it creates an issue about participation, and in particular, it's going to present and does present problems taking instructions from people, specifically those who have communication difficulties and rely on body language, cues, facial expressions, and so on, not just to understand the person giving advice, but also to make themselves understood. And with those communication difficulties in mind, it may make someone feel like they're not heard, that they're out of control, and that the system is happening and they're just a passenger in that system. And they may feel completely disempowered.
in those circumstances, we need to be alive to the fact that those are risk factors which may reduce their emotional resilience. In public law cases where children have been separated from their parents and perhaps placed in foster care, for example, we're all aware that face-to-face contact isn't happening. Now, I know from my own experience how frustrating and upsetting it is not to be able to go and see family members and friends and put my arms around them, and to spend time, physical time with them, have them in the proximity of you. Now, for children who have been removed from their parents or in an unusual set of circumstances, they might feel scared. They might be children who worry about their parents anyway, and they might have needed the reassurance that comes from seeing their parents and receiving some physical reassurance from them. And likewise, for parents involved in the process, one can only imagine how painful it is not to be able to have that physical contact with their child and to reassure their child that everything's okay. Also, in private law cases, there are many cases that I've heard about where parents are using the current lockdown situation to prevent a child from spending time or living with the other parent. And again, this is going to create difficulties in terms of the levels of stress that people are experiencing at this time. And in financial cases, there'll be those who are facing financial uncertainty as a result of the crisis, and they may be worrying about whether or not they can fund litigation or even pay the mortgage. One of the things that I wanted to do, as I said at the outset, was utilise this opportunity, especially given it it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week, to remind one another to look out for each other. Life as a family practitioner is difficult anyway. We frequently have to look at disturbing material and confront sets of facts which can be very distressing. We often have to give advice which deeply affects our clients and is difficult to deliver as much as it's, well, not quite as much, but in the way that it's difficult for your client to hear. We frequently encounter people in dire circumstances and are regularly in contact with people who have complex mental health profiles, the disenfranchised, the most vulnerable members of our society, those who face loss of relationships, jobs, reputation, liberty, children, and those who are suffering financial and emotional hardship as a result of being involved in the justice system. These are all things that already exist, just in terms of our lives generally. But at the moment, things have become even more difficult for practitioners because COVID-19 has caused financial uncertainty and potentially financial hardship. It's also challenged the way that we have to work and has forced us to adapt and evolve very quickly and in far from ideal circumstances. And I've no shame in admitting that first week after lockdown was announced, I was experiencing my own personal hell as I tried to get to grips with all of the different platforms that we had to access, the different software and hardware, realizing that my hardware was not up to the job, having to lay out money to purchase hardware so that I did have the right materials to be able to conduct hearings remotely. And I came to that from the position of already having worked from e-bundles for about 12 months almost exclusively. But I know that many people have had to work from paper bundles to e-bundles, and trying to navigate that at the same time as juggling everything else is just impossibly difficult at times. And we might feel isolated. And in particular to the profession, I'm sure I'm not speaking only for myself when I say that I miss those moments at court, which sometimes are levelling moments following a bust-up with an opponent, where you can either go and talk to somebody and let off steam and say, I can't believe, this has just happened, or just saying to your opponent afterwards, should we go for a coffee? Should we go and get a cup of tea or something? And talking about something completely not related to work, so that you've managed to level yourself again and restore your balance. These types of conversations were things that were of value. They had worth. And we're now in a position of having lost that. I know some people are great at setting up Zoom meetings and so on, and there might be some good camaraderie still in some of those Zoom advocates meetings. But when you do have that situation arise where something becomes quite fractious within the discussions, then it is quite difficult just to leave that group feeling quite upset perhaps by something that's been said or the way that it's been said, and not have an opportunity to balance that out. One of the things as well that I'm sure all of us can relate to is that it's so difficult not being able to see our tribunal and knowing when a point's landed, or when we need to elaborate on a point, or when we need to just outright abandon a point and jettison it completely. And that's quite difficult, because we do look to our judges for cues to know how our arguments are going. And as a profession of perfectionists, it's quite difficult if, once you've then gone through your submissions and rattled through them without being able to see your tribunal, you get to the end and you don't get the result you're thinking of. And if that happens to you, then it's bound to have an impact on your self, how you see yourself. And we're all quite self-critical, I know that. And so it's going to have an impact on us. Also, virtual hearings are exhausting, especially those which are undertaken by telephone. And I don't know about anybody else, but despite the fact that I no longer have to travel to court and back and battle my way with other commuters, I still find a telephone hearing about 10 times more exhausting than having made the journey into town to deal with a hearing. So what I'm urging you all to do in these difficult times is just be aware that the stresses are increased for all of us. It's really important that we fearlessly and absolutely rigorously and pursue our clients' cases, but don't make that at the expense of having been unkind to somebody or humiliating an opponent unnecessarily. It's quite possible to fight your clients' cases without resorting to being unkind or rude. And I'd also urge all of you to just drop in with your colleagues, especially those you know might be struggling more than other people. Just see how they are and check if they're okay. And remember this, talking is critical. It does help, and there's never any shame in signalling when you need help. Okay, thank you very much for your kind attention. I don't know if there have been any questions, Rukaya.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. That was really brilliant. We do have one question here. Could you please go through the process of how you determine where to signpost to, particularly if the client is already overwhelmed and or reluctant to act?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because who you signpost to is going to be very fact specific, and how you do that with a particular client is going to be very much fact specific. So if you've got a client who's particularly distressed, what I would advise is that you stay with them. You allow them that moment to be distressed and to express that distress to you. And what I would say is that you then need to consider who might be the appropriate person to put that your client in touch with. So for example, we'll often have clients who attend court with family members occasionally from time to time. We might know from the papers or from previous experience that they've got a friend or family member that they trust to help them with the proceedings. You might think about saying to your client, can I contact Miss Jones for you and ask her to come to court so that you've got somebody here? Or if there's not somebody like that, you might say it's really important to your client to say to them, I want to help you, but I want to make sure that you're safe when you go away from court. Is there someone I can call to meet you? Or ask them about their GP, call their GP, for example. If they continue to be extremely distressed and you're really worried about them, then and you're worried about their immediate safety, then it does become appropriate to dial 999 and get that person immediate help. And I say that with all seriousness, we mustn't underestimate the risk when one considers that it's the biggest killer of men under the age of 50 in this country. It's a risk that we need to take seriously. I hope that answers that question.
It sounds like it did. There's no, yeah, she's just said thank you. I think that figure is quite shocking, actually. I didn't know that myself until you told us. Right, so another question is, to what extent do you think we ought to raise our concerns with the court or opponents if your client is suicidal without breaching privilege?
Really difficult call, this one, I think. And on reflection, having looked at the advice from the Law Society and considered the advice that I was given on the ethics helpline, I think that ultimately we should not be sharing information with our opponents about our clients' mental health without our clients express consent to that. Without express consent, it seems to me that we should be limiting our disclosure only to those people who will then be able to assist our clients to be safe for now. So that will include GP or another mental health practitioner, for example. But I think that without consent, we shouldn't be sharing with others what our clients told us. I have to say that one of the circumstances that I found myself in last year, I represented a child that came across a mother in the proceedings. So she wasn't my client. And I actually recall taking the step of telling her that I couldn't keep what she was telling me confidential to me, that I had a duty to the court and that I would need to tell people what was happening and what was being said. And she accepted that in that discussion. But clearly our duty wouldn't extend to people who aren't our own clients.
Okay, great. Any further questions from anybody? No, no other questions? Great. Well, I think, okay.
Ask a question, but can I make a point, which is that for some of us who may have elderly relatives who are vulnerable at this time, it's important to know that suicide rates go up again quite radically after the age of 75. And that whole concept of being a burden, not having anything to look forward to, in pain, financially disadvantaged, you make that list that you very, very successfully. Really congratulate you on this webinar. They are in getting old, and the statistics are a bit hidden because it's not the highest cause of death. The highest cause of death is obviously heart attack and obviously old age, but that figures per 100,000 are comparable to some of the younger age groups, and obviously that's highly important for us, you know, in our family lives as well. Just a thought.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'm really glad that you raised that point, to be honest. Within the handout on the very first page, I include the figures per 100,000 of the population. And you're absolutely right that the figures heartbreakingly jump in the over 75 groups. So to give you an idea, these are the figures from 2018, which are the last official figures that we have in the UK. 160 men per 100,000 of the population over the age of 75 ended their own lives. Now, if one looks at the figures, I'll go from the lowest age to the highest. Males aged between 10 and 24, the figure was 9. 25 to 44 was 206. 45 to 64 was 216. 65 to 74 is 117. And then, as has already been identified correctly, when we get to 75 plus, it jumps really quite dramatically to 160. And so those figures are particularly troubling. And I agree that at this time, it's so vitally important that we don't allow our elders to feel that they are unsupported or lonely. And I think actually COVID itself causes an issue with that, because for some people, their actions indicate that they don't care so much about the older generation, because it's almost as though COVID affects them and not us. So thank you for raising that point. Are there any other further questions?
There aren't any other questions that have come in.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I'm really grateful, and I know it's a difficult subject, but it's a really important one. So I'm really grateful to all of you that tuned in and gave this your time. And if you think of anybody else who might benefit from watching this webinar, it will be available on Coram's YouTube page after today. And perhaps if you wanted to share it with those people, I'd be grateful. So thank you very much.